All right, let's jump right in. Today we're taking a deep dive into the global economic landscape with a special focus on Indonesia and its role in the ASEAN region. We've got some really interesting sources to unpack here, starting with the IMF's World Economic Outlook for 2024. And we've also got a collection of reports that zero in on Indonesia's economic performance and trade relations. Now, just glancing at these reports, we're already seeing some intriguing trends emerge, like the fact that global inflation seems to be cooling down. We'll see if that lasts. And then there's this rise in social unrest, which seems to be tied to economic anxieties. Plus, we're seeing this boom in investment in Indonesia, but not always in the places you might expect. So are you ready to dive in with me?
Absolutely. It's going to be fascinating to see how these global trends connect with what's happening on the ground in Indonesia.
Okay, so first up, let's tackle this IMF report. It paints this picture of a global economy that's kind of stuck in the slow lane. Global growth is projected to be around a modest 3.2% in 2024. And while inflation is expected to ease up a bit, reaching 5.8%, there are still a lot of question marks hanging in the air. What are your initial thoughts on all of this?
Well, one thing that really jumps out at me is this shift that the IMF is calling a policy pivot. During the pandemic, governments and central banks were basically pumping money into their economies to keep things afloat, but those days are over. Now what we're seeing is a move toward more disciplined fiscal and monetary policies. So basically a global tightening of the belt, so to speak.
Right, so it's like governments are trying to get their financial houses back in order, reining in debt and rebuilding those financial safety nets that had to be tapped into during the crisis. But I imagine that's a pretty tricky balancing act, right?
Absolutely. It's what the IMF keeps referring to as this narrow path to adjustment. They're basically urging governments to consolidate their finances without choking off economic growth. It's a real tightrope walk.
Especially when you consider this other trend the IMF highlighted, the rise in social unrest around the world. They're pointing to things like inflation eating away at people's purchasing power and higher taxes as potential triggers. It makes you wonder, could this be a concern for Indonesia too?
It's definitely worth considering, especially when we look at some of Indonesia's economic vulnerabilities. The IMF report specifically flags rising commodity prices as a potential pressure point. Indonesia is very reliant on commodities like coal and palm oil, and those price swings can have a real impact on people's livelihoods and on the overall economy.
Right, okay, so we've got this global economic backdrop with its own set of challenges and uncertainties. Now, let's zoom in specifically on Indonesia. What's the economic story there?
Well, despite those global headwinds, Indonesia's economy has actually shown a lot of resilience. They managed to achieve 5% growth in 2023, which was primarily driven by strong domestic demand. It really shows the power of Indonesia's 270 million consumers.
Yeah, it's amazing how much domestic spending contributes to Indonesia's overall GDP. We're talking over 52%. That's huge. But I did notice that the growth has slowed down a bit compared to 2022. Is that simply a reflection of the global slowdown, or is there more to it?
It's likely a combination of factors. The global slowdown is definitely playing a role, as are efforts to control inflation. But we also need to consider some of the structural challenges that Indonesia is facing. The OECD Economic Survey of Indonesia 2023 actually highlights this. They point to the need for improvements in education and skills to really boost productivity and innovation.
Right, that makes sense. Investing in people is definitely key for a long-term growth. But let's shift gears for a second and talk about Indonesia's international trade relationships. They've been signing new trade agreements left and right. What's the latest on that front?
Well, the latest one they've secured is the Indonesia-UAE Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, or SIPA. And they're currently in discussions with the Gulf Cooperation Council for another potential agreement. So clearly, Indonesia sees trade as a key driver of its economic growth, and they're actively expanding their network of partnerships.
Yeah, they've got a pretty impressive portfolio. I think it's something like 38 trade agreements in total. But here's something I found interesting. While Indonesia is inking all these deals, most of their top export products actually saw a decline in 2023. We're talking things like coal, palm oil, even rubber.
That's right. Falling commodity prices have really impacted Indonesia's traditional export sectors. But there is a bit of a bright spot. We're also seeing increasing trends in exports of things like precious metals and nickel, which hints at some interesting developments.
Okay, now you've got my attention. Tell me more about these interesting developments. What's going on there?
Well, remember how we talked about Indonesia's push for downstream industries? If you look at the numbers, we're seeing a decline in imports of raw and intermediate goods. Coupled with those increased exports in sectors like metal and nickel, It suggests that Indonesia is moving up the value chain. They're focusing more on processing and manufacturing rather than just exporting raw materials.
That's a smart move, especially with the growing global demand for electric vehicle batteries and all those critical minerals that go into them. It sounds like Indonesia is trying to carve out a really strategic position for itself in those global supply chains.
Exactly. And that actually leads us to another interesting trend. The investment boom that's happening in Indonesia. Total investment flow into the country surged by a massive 17.5% in 2023. It's a pretty clear sign that investors are recognizing Indonesia's potential.
Okay, so let's break down this investment surge. Where's all this money going? Is it mainly foreign investors or are Indonesian businesses stepping up to the plate?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. We're actually seeing a near equal split between foreign and domestic direct investment. Domestic investment accounts for 47.6% of the total, which I think is a really strong indicator of confidence in the Indonesian economy.
That's fantastic. It shows that Indonesian businesses are putting their money where their mouth is, so to speak.
Right.
So which sectors are attracting the most investment, both foreign and domestic?
Well, the metal and metal goods sector is definitely leading the charge. No surprise there, considering all the focus on downstream industries and that electric vehicle battery supply chain. But we're also seeing significant investment in transportation, warehousing, telecommunications, and the chemical and pharmaceutical industries. So it's a pretty diverse portfolio, which is good news for Indonesia's overall economic resilience.
Yeah, it's like they're not putting all their eggs in one basket. But let's get a little more granular. Is this investment spread evenly across the country, or are certain regions emerging as hotspots?
That's a great question, and it actually brings us to some really interesting geographical trends. West Java province is still the most attractive location, pulling in 16.5% of the investment. It's got those well-established industrial zones and the proximity to Jakarta. But here's the thing. Central Sulawesi and North Maluku province are also attracting a lot of attention from investors.
Wait, really? Central Sulawesi, North Maluku.
Right.
Those aren't exactly known as major industrial hubs. What's driving the investment there?
Well, when you connect it back to what we've been talking about with downstream industries and critical minerals, it starts to make sense. Central Sulawesi and North Maluku are rich in those mineral resources. And we're seeing a lot of investment in things like smelter development and other facilities related to mineral processing. It's all part of Indonesia's strategy to move up the value chain and really capitalize on the global demand for these resources.
This is fascinating. Seems like Indonesia is making some seriously strategic moves.
They are. But we should also be aware of the potential implications of this geographical shift in investment, not just from an economic standpoint, but also from a security perspective.
That's a really good point. We've been talking a lot about the economics of all this, but it's clear that these trends have much broader implications. It's like a giant game of economic chess where every move has ripple effects.
Exactly. And that's something we'll delve into further as we continue our deep dive. Stay tuned as we explore the nuances of these trends and what they mean for Indonesia's future in the global economy. Welcome back to our deep dive into Indonesia's economic landscape. Before the break, we were talking about that remarkable surge in investment, especially in those regions rich in mineral resources like Central Sulawesi and North Maluku. And I mentioned that this shift could have some significant implications, not just economically, but also in terms of security.
Okay, yeah, you definitely piqued my curiosity there. What kind of security implications are we talking about? Is it about protecting these new investments, or is there a bigger picture here?
It's multifaceted, really. On the one hand, you absolutely have to think about the safety and security of these investments themselves, especially given some of the remote locations and the potential for instability. But then there's also the geopolitical dimension to consider. As Indonesia becomes a key player in those global supply chains for critical minerals, well, it's bound to attract attention. And not all of that attention will be positive.
Right, of course. Those resources are essential for everything these days. We're talking smartphones, electric vehicle batteries, renewable energy technologies. It's no wonder countries are scrambling to secure their access to these materials.
Exactly. And that actually brings it another crucial point from the IMF report. They highlight the importance of international cooperation when it comes to accelerating economic decarbonization. In a world that's grappling with climate change, access to those critical minerals is becoming increasingly strategic, and Indonesia is right at the heart of that global shift.
Okay, so we've got this fascinating interplay between economics, security, and sustainability. But let's not forget about the people who are at the heart of all of this. The IMF report also touched upon the issue of social unrest. And I'm curious to explore that a bit further. What are some of the key factors that are driving this unrest? And how is Indonesia trying to address those concerns?
Well, the IMF points to things like rising inflation, higher taxes, and the erosion of purchasing power as potential triggers for social unrest. Those are global pressures, of course, but they can become amplified in countries with high levels of inequality or where social safety nets are weak. Now, fortunately, Indonesia has been taking steps to try and mitigate the impact of these pressures, especially for more vulnerable populations.
That's good to hear. What kind of measures have they put in place? Are we talking about social safety nets, subsidies, or something else entirely?
It's actually a combination of approaches. They have programs like the Family Hope program, which provides conditional cash transfers to low-income families. That helps them with basic needs and also encourages investment in things like education and health. And then there are also fuel subsidies, which, while they can be controversial, aim to cushion the impact of those rising energy prices on consumers.
So it sounds like they're trying to strike a balance between addressing those immediate needs and also promoting longer-term economic stability. But I imagine that's a tough balance to get right.
Absolutely, it is a challenge. And the IMF report really emphasizes the need for those carefully calibrated fiscal policies. They're urging governments to consolidate their finances, but without undermining essential social spending or stifling economic growth. It's a delicate balancing act.
And that brings us back to this idea of a policy pivot that we were discussing earlier. Governments around the world are kind of shifting away from those loose monetary and fiscal policies that were really characteristic of the pandemic response. How is Indonesia navigating this transition?
Well, the OECD Economic Survey of Indonesia 2023 actually offers some good insights on that. They highlight the need for some structural reforms to address some of those deeper economic challenges and enhance competitiveness.
Reforms. They're always a bit of a touchy subject, aren't they? They often involve some difficult trade-offs, and they can be met with a lot of resistance. What kind of reforms are we talking about specifically?
Well, the OECD report specifically mentions the need to improve education and skills development. They also talk about enhancing regulatory efficiency and fostering a more competitive business environment. Those are all areas where, if you can implement some targeted reforms, you could unlock a lot of economic potential and create opportunities for Indonesians.
So it sounds like they're trying to lay the groundwork for a more innovative and dynamic economy. But I am curious about the timeline here. Are we talking about short-term changes, or is this more of a long-term vision?
It's definitely more of a long-term vision, and it requires sustained commitment and really effective implementation. The OECD report actually stresses the importance of social consensus when it comes to these reforms.
That's a really good point. If people feel like they're not being heard, or that the benefits of those changes aren't being shared fairly, well, it can lead to pushback.
Yeah.
And that can undermine the whole process.
Exactly. For reforms to be successful, you need to have clear communication, consultation, and take measures to address the concerns of those who might be impacted. It's about building trust and demonstrating that these changes will have long-term benefits for all Indonesians.
So it's not just about tweaking policies. It's about bringing people along on the journey. That's a crucial part of any successful economic transformation.
Absolutely. And it's particularly important in a country as diverse and dynamic as Indonesia. The OECD report also highlights the importance of things like strengthening governance and tackling corruption. Those are absolutely essential for creating a level playing field and fostering sustainable economic growth.
Right? It's about creating an environment where everyone has a fair shot at success and where the benefits of growth are shared equitably. That's a really powerful vision. And it's encouraging to see that Indonesia is taking those challenges seriously.
It is. And as we move into the final part of our deep dive, we'll be connecting the dots between these various trends and exploring what they mean for Indonesia's future in the global economy. Stay tuned for a thought-provoking conclusion that'll leave you pondering Indonesia's economic trajectory long after this deep dive ends.
Welcome back for the final part of our deep dive into Indonesia's economic landscape. We've covered a lot of ground, from that global economic outlook to the very specific challenges and opportunities Indonesia is facing. So let's try to pull it all together and see what insights we can glean from all of this.
I like how you put that, pull it all together. It really has felt like we've been on this journey tracing Indonesia's economic story through these reports. And what a story it's been.
It really has. We started with that IMF report, with its cautious but, relatively steady global forecast. Remember that 3.2% growth projection for 2024?
Yeah.
And the whole world trying to get a handle on inflation. But then we zoomed in on Indonesia. This economy that's kind of defying those global headwinds with its 5% growth in 2023, all fueled by the strength of its domestic demand.
And that domestic strength is really key. Over 52% of Indonesia's GDP comes from household consumption. That's a powerful engine. And it speaks to the rising purchasing power of Indonesia's 270 million consumers.
Right. It's not just about spending, though. We also saw how Indonesia is really strategically positioning itself in the global economy.
Yeah.
They're not just along for the ride when it comes to globalization. They're actively shaping their own economic destiny.
Absolutely. Those 38 trade agreements are definitely not just for show. Indonesia is building partnerships, expanding their reach, diversifying those economic relationships. And while traditional exports like coal and palm oil might have taken a hit from those falling commodity prices, we're also seeing something new emerge, the rise of those precious metals and nickel exports.
That whole shift towards downstream industries and the electric vehicle battery supply chain is fascinating. It's like Indonesia saying to the world, we're not just a source of raw materials, we're adding value, we're innovating, and we're becoming a key player in these really important global industries.
Exactly. And investors are noticing that surge in investment, a 17.5% increase in 2023. That's huge. And what's really encouraging is that nearly half of that investment is coming from domestic sources. Indonesian businesses are putting their faith in their own economy, and that's a really strong signal.
It's like this huge vote of confidence, not just from global players, but from the people who really know Indonesia best. But as we discussed, this investment isn't just going to those established industrial hubs like West Java. We're seeing this interesting shift towards regions like Central Sulawesi and North Maluku, places that are rich in those critical minerals that are driving the green technology revolution.
And that's where those economic considerations start to intersect with security concerns, right?
These investments, they need to be protected, not just from the traditional threats, but also from the geopolitical maneuvering that's likely to intensify as competition for these resources heats up. It's a high-stakes game, and Indonesia's right in the middle of it. But we can't forget about the human dimension here. The IMF report highlighted that risk of social unrest. They're driven by factors like inflation, inequality, that erosion of purchasing power.
And while Indonesia has taken steps to implement social safety nets and subsidies to try to protect those vulnerable populations, it's a constant balancing act, right? The OECD report emphasized the need for careful fiscal consolidation. It's about finding that sweet spot where you can manage debt without sacrificing those essential social programs or stifling economic growth.
It's a lot to manage.
Yeah.
And it requires some really skillful leadership and a commitment to good governance. But it's not just about those short-term challenges either. We talked about those structural reforms that are needed, those long-term changes that can really unlock Indonesia's full economic potential.
Exactly. Reforms in education and skills development, improvements in regulatory efficiency, fostering a more competitive business environment, those are the ingredients you need to build a more innovative, inclusive, and sustainable economy.
It's about creating an environment where all Indonesians can actually benefit from the country's economic progress and where the next generation has the tools and the opportunities they need to thrive.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up our deep dive today, I think the big takeaway is this. Indonesia is on this incredible journey. They're leveraging their strengths, they're navigating some really complex challenges, and they're making strategic choices to shape their own future.
It's a story of resilience, ambition, a real determination to build a better future. And as we've seen, it's a story that's deeply connected to the global economy, to security, and to the well-being of the Indonesian people.
It's a story that's still being written, for sure, full of twists and turns. But ultimately, I think it's a story of hope and possibility.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder all of the different facets of Indonesia's economic journey. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.